I have a theory about why overland travel in D&D can often be boring, which I'll get into later. In the 4th edition D&D Dungeon Master's Guide, it says, the game spends a lot of time in exploration mode. Then it proceeds to give 1 page of advice on exploration, and then 100 pages of advice on combat. So while they're saying exploration is a big pillar, the quantity of rules don't support that. So I thought I would look back on 20 years of exploration advice in D&D, and more specifically, advice on travel and overland management, which is usually listed as a subset of exploration in these books. We've got the 4E DMG, we have the 4E DMG 2, the 2014 DMG, and the 2024 DMG. Ugh, this thing is heavy. Ugh. We're going to see what advice they have for us, and maybe we can take all the best bits and smush them together into a Frankenstein subsystem. Sorry, I meant Frankenstein's monsters subsystem. Wait, did I mean that? Anyway, I'm going to compare and contrast a little, but we're not going to do a boring deep dive into the semantics of minor word changes. Let's talk about the fun stuff. Let's build a system that is quick, robust, and flexible. But first, you know how lots of people pointed out the sinister conspiracy of shrinkflation in 5e books by using larger fonts? Well, compare the 2024 DMG and the 4e DMG. Same font size. Anyway, since I have you, could I get a like and subscribe below? It only takes a second and it helps us both out. Make sure to click all next to notifications and click the join button to get exclusive perks when you join my channel. Let's kick this off with the 2008 Dungeon Master's Guide, also known as the 4th edition DMG. In this book, we get 4 pages on travel and exploration. When defining exploration, the book says, it usually fills the space between encounters. It usually ends when an encounter begins, and this is simple enough. Later, in a section on outdoor settings, the book says not to place planned encounters in specific locations, rather to keep them abstract so you can plop them down in front of the PCs as needed. And it gives us advice to think of overland travel like an extended skill challenge. I think this idea has merit, so we'll come back to that in a minute. Stay tuned. The 4E DMG has brief entries on weather and environmental dangers, and then starvation, thirst, and suffocation. But then we finally get a table on page 159 with a list of conditions and DCs to survive them. Obviously, these DCs don't apply to modern D&D, but we could use this little table as a kind of 1d9 random event generator. And then there's some guidance about dying from the elements. 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without air. The book suggests endurance saves, which would translate to con saves in 5e. In 4e, if you fail one of these saves, you lose healing surges, which was a thing in that edition. Well, what if we replaced healing surges with hit dice? As in, a penalty for going without food or water is the loss of hit dice. This makes narrative sense because when you're exposed to the elements over time, your ability to recover becomes weakened. You could also use levels of exhaustion, but I think penalizing hit dice creates some interesting situations. If you've lost half your hit dice because you haven't eaten, then it makes getting into the next combat much riskier since you know you might not be able to heal afterward until your next long rest. Now let's talk briefly about the 4th edition DMG. This book says almost nothing about travel and exploration, but I bought the book so I want to show it off. Seriously though, there's one little section in here that I think is worth talking about. On page 94 there's a skill challenge called the Rushing River. If you're not familiar with skill challenges, they were a 4E thing that allowed you to run encounters without combat by using skill checks, and accumulating a certain number of successes before reaching a certain number of failures. I don't run them exactly as they are in 4E, but I made a whole different video about that, so I'm not going to get into it here. Here's the TLDR version. Skill challenges can be a lot of fun if you lean into the narrative aspects of them. So, the Rushing River. This is a wilderness encounter where the party is following an orc down a river. The river has rapids, then a group of ghosts appear, then the PCs go through an underground tunnel, then they either find the orc or don't. This is what the DMG2 calls a structure challenge. It says a skill challenge that takes place between other encounters gives structure to a part of the game that would otherwise be exploration time. A challenge of this sort is clearly an abstraction. It distills large amounts of unstructured activity down into a number of skill checks. And then the skill challenge itself is laid out in 5 steps. Stage 1 is Wilderness, where the party gets the plot hook about the fleeing orc and finds a canoe to pursue. Ignore the primary and secondary skills list. This is one place where I disagree with 4E. Let the players use whatever skills they want. Just reserve this list for inspiration in case they struggle to come up with ideas. Stage 2 is the Rapids, where PCs will have to make checks to brave the rushing river. Stage 3 is a brief respite determined by how many successes the party has accumulated so far. In Stage 4, ghosts appear who claim to be guardians of the river and you have to negotiate passage with them. Then Stage 5 goes underground toward our final inevitable meeting with the orc. And what I'm advising you to steal from this is mostly the idea of structured stages of an extended skill challenge. In Stage 1, the party has to say succeed 3 times before failing twice. Then in Stage 2, we'll make it succeed 5 times before failing 3 times. I'll go into more detail on this later. And you don't have to use the orc plot hook. The PCs could simply find this canoe and have to brave the river to proceed to wherever their destination is. But these 5 stages could easily comprise one adventuring day of overland travel. I have a theory that downtime and travel can be boring in D&D because that's where the game has the least structure. So I really like this idea of structuring travel as either an overall skill challenge or else a series of interconnected skill challenges. We'll come back to this in a second, because that brings us to the first edition of the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. The 5e DMG published in 2014 has much beefier travel rules. It gives us 2 options for narrating travel, the montage approach and the hour-by-hour approach. I'd say we can add structured skill challenges as a 3rd option. Let's keep it in mind as we go. We get more advice about hazards like quicksand and weather events, but it doesn't really tell us how and when to use these. I do like this section on tracking and how DCs should adjust based on factors like surface type and time elapsed. This is good, solid advice with practical mechanics. Take a second to skim it. And finally, the 2nd edition of the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons is now upon us, and we have the 2024 DMG. It's pretty, but damn, it's heavy. Let me direct your attention right away to this section on journey stages. I'll give you another second to read this. It's good advice. Ooh, maybe we could blend this with our structured skill challenge idea. Okay, let's hang on to that while I recap the rest of the 2024 travel advice. This new DMG lays out 4 steps for travel. 1. Set the pace. 2. Narrate the travel. 3. Track food and water. And 4. Track progress. And it also includes advice on foraging, navigating, and obstacles. Overall, if I had to pick a single Dungeon Master's Guide for travel, I would probably recommend the 2024 DMG. This book is like a greatest hits, and it has useful advice and systems, but how do we build the perfect game loop for implementing it? What I don't want to do is take 5e and drop a bunch of complex subsystems on top of it. 5e already has enough rules. So how do we blend the best of all these books without making something that's hard to learn at the table? Above all, I think a travel system should be simple and robust. You should be able to improv a complete journey without needing to do prep. And for this, I'm going to recommend we adapt one of the all-time best game subsystems, and that is Call of Cthulhu's chase system. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Jim, that is an entirely different game, and yes, that is an astute observation. But stay with me because I'm going to show you how we blend 4E's structured skill challenges, 2024's journey stages, and Call of Cthulhu 7th edition's chases. Ready? Check this out. Call of Cthulhu says you think of your chases as an abstract series of sequential locations, and so you put a line of dots on a sheet of paper. Left dot's the starting point, farthest right dot is the final location. You don't have to know which exact future location is which dot in case the action isn't going along a linear route or you don't have the later stages thought out yet. Like I said, it's abstract. That upcoming dot could be a river, or a mountain path, or a strange obelisk, or whatever is logical for the journey. It's free-flowing and adaptable. And so you can prepare this in advance or do it on the fly just by putting some dots on a sheet of paper. Next are complications in the form of hazards and barriers, which you also write on the sheet with the dots. In 5e travel, you can use random tables to determine those obstacles or prep specific encounters or hazards at various points. In this screenshot, there are separate lines for start of the round and end of the round, but we don't need to do that. We just need the left dot as the starting point, farthest right dot as the final location. You can Google Random Wilderness Hazard Table 5e to find pre-made tables, but I recommend making your own so it's specific to your campaign, especially if travel comes up a lot. But what I like about all of this is the simplicity so it can be run quickly to keep the sense of action at the table high. So we blend this dot travel system with 5e by making the space between each dot a skill challenge. And each dot acts as a leg on the journey. Say our party is going to traverse a swamp to get from one city to another. So we put 4 dots on a map to represent 3 stages of travel. The dot on the left is the starting city, dot on the right is ending city. Now we assign locations to the dots. Dot 2 is going to be an abandoned hut along the journey where the PCs can rest and maybe uncover a plot hook or a clue or two. Dot 3 is going to be a border checkpoint where we can pass along exposition about the city they're traveling to. Dot 4 is the end. Now we put in 3 skill challenges to fill the space between the dots. Our first skill challenge, let's make it a navigational one. The players can show off their nature and survival skills while eventually finding the abandoned hut. The second skill challenge, maybe we make it an environmental one. Throw quicksand and storms or whatever at your players. The third skill challenge maybe is some sort of race to get to the city. You can figure that out later. So we have 3 skill challenges and 4 location dots. Our first and fourth dots are the beginning and end of the journey. The second dot is an abandoned cabin in the swamp. I'd probably put a Schrodinger's combat encounter here if your players haven't faced combat yet on this journey. And then the third dot is the border crossing. This could turn into combat, or it could be a social encounter, or it could turn into a chase all the way into the city. But the point is, this dot stage system is flexible enough that we can prep it out all in advance, or we can sketch it out on notebook paper in just a couple minutes if we need to improv travel without much warning. Loose and pliable without adding a bunch of rules to an already complex system. What do you think? If you haven't seen my video on running skill challenges, check it out because I think there's a way to make them fun without feeling too mechanical. Anyway, I hope I've given you some inspiration here to help make your travel segments smoother. Until next time, I'm GM Jim. Now go find out what's lurking in that forest.